A birthday party is happening inside Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Balloons float near tables covered in pizza grease and spilled soda. Children scream with the particular high-pitched joy that only comes from sugar, arcade games, and the promise of cake. Parents sit in booths along the perimeter, grateful for 2 hours where someone else handles the chaos. The animatronics on stage move through their programmed routines. Freddy sings, Bonnie plays guitar, Chica waves. Everything is exactly as it should be. But in the back hallway, past the restrooms, past the area where parents are supposed to pay attention, a door opens. A yellow rabbit costume steps into view. Spring Bonnie, one of the old characters from the original diner, retired now but still recognizable to children who've grown up with these mascots. The rabbit doesn't speak, just gestures, beckons. Come see something special. Come meet your favorite character up close. And because children have been taught that costumes mean safety, that places like this are protected spaces, that adults in mascot suits have been approved and vetted and checked, a child follows, then another, then another. 5 children will enter that back room in 1985. None of them will leave. This is the story of the missing children incident. Over the next several hours, we're going to examine how a single act of violence transformed a family entertainment venue into a crime scene, how institutional structures designed to protect children instead enabled their murders, and why the aftermath of this event would create decades of supernatural horror that persists because the systems that allowed it to happen were never actually dismantled. By the end, you'll understand how trust becomes a weapon, how businesses calculate the cost of human life against quarterly earnings, and why some tragedies repeat not because people forget, but because remembering doesn't change the incentive structures that made them possible in the first place. This analysis explores how institutional failures, corporate negligence, and predatory exploitation converge to create one of the most horrifying incidents in the Freddys timeline, examining both the mechanics of the crime and the broader systemic patterns it exemplifies. The internet never sleeps, and neither does this channel. Drop your location and local time below so I can see who my fellow night owls are. You can also suggest a topic for a future deep dive. Some of the best videos have come directly from your suggestions. So now get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Trust. Before we can understand what happened on June 26, we need to understand the environment where it happened. Family entertainment venues function through a specific psychological mechanism that makes parents comfortable leaving children in semi-supervised environments. This isn't accidental. The entire business model depends on creating spaces where parental vigilance can be relaxed because the establishment itself signals safety. Think about how this works in practice. A parent who would never let their 6-year-old talk to a stranger on the street will allow that same child to wander 20 feet away at a pizzeria to play arcade games. The commercial context overrides normal protective instincts. The presence of other families creates a diffusion of responsibility, where everyone assumes someone else is watching. The corporate branding suggests that background checks have been performed, that employees have been vetted, that the company has insurance and liability concerns that require maintaining safe conditions. This trust architecture is deliberate. Children could move freely between arcade games, dining areas, and performance stages while parents relaxed in designated seating zones. The business model monetized parental exhaustion and children's need for stimulation simultaneously. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza operated on this exact template. Parents paid for birthday party packages that included food, entertainment, and implicit supervision. The animatronics performed programmed shows that kept children engaged. The arcade games provided additional distraction. The entire facility was designed to feel safe through its very existence as a commercial enterprise serving families. But safety theater is not the same as actual safety. The mechanisms that make parents feel comfortable are not the same mechanisms that would prevent harm, and the gap between those two things creates opportunities for predators who understand how to exploit the difference. William Afton understood this gap comprehensively. He was co-owner of Fazbear Entertainment, which gave him unlimited access to every area of the facility. He understood the layout. knew which spaces had camera coverage and which didn't, recognized the times when employees were distracted by rush periods versus quiet moments when attention might notice anomalies. More importantly, he understood the psychological frameworks that made the venue function. He knew parents were trained to trust branded environments. He knew children were conditioned to recognize and approach mascot characters. He knew the institutional response to problems would prioritize liability management over criminal investigation. This knowledge wasn't theoretical. William had already tested these systems with Charlotte Emily's murder years earlier. He'd lured Henry's daughter outside the pizzeria using the establishment's own security gaps, killed her in circumstances that should have triggered immediate investigation, and watched as the case went cold because investigators couldn't imagine someone at the top of an institutional hierarchy being the perpetrator. The lesson was clear. Institutional structures protect people with authority and access. They assume threats come from outside, from strangers, from people without legitimate reasons to be present. The missing children incident would prove how thoroughly those assumptions could be weaponized. Family entertainment venues create what psychologists call institutional trust transfer. Children are taught stranger danger. Don't talk to people you don't know. Don't accept gifts from unfamiliar adults. Don't go anywhere with someone you haven't been introduced to by a parent. But then those same children are taught that these rules have exceptions. People in uniforms are safe. People in costumes at designated entertainment venues are safe. People working at commercial establishments have been approved and therefore don't trigger the same warning signals as random adults on the street. This creates a vulnerability that predators throughout history have exploited. John Wayne Gacy performed as Pogo the Clown at children's parties and charity events throughout the 1970s, while simultaneously murdering 33 young men and boys. The costume gave him access to spaces and victims he wouldn't have reached otherwise. It signaled trustworthiness. When Gacy appeared as Pogo, he wasn't a middle-aged contractor with a criminal history of sexual assault. He was a clown, which meant he was entertaining, approved, safe. Gacy's victims weren't killed while he wore the costume. He lured them to his home through other methods. But the clown persona served a different purpose. It established him as a community figure, someone known for volunteering, someone parents recognized as being involved in children's entertainment. This social proof made it harder for people to imagine him as a threat. The costume created a psychological buffer between his public identity and his private predation. William Afton's use of the Spring Bonnie costume followed similar logic but with even more institutional protection. Spring Bonnie wasn't just any costume. It was one of the original characters from Fredbear's Family Diner, recognizable to children who'd grown up attending these establishments. The character had been retired from active use, stored in back areas where it wouldn't be seen by customers during normal operations. This made it perfect for William's purposes. He could wear it without other employees questioning why he was in character outside of scheduled performance times. The costume gave him permission to exist in transitional spaces between public dining areas and restricted back rooms. When children saw Spring Bonnie, they saw a familiar friend. They'd been conditioned through months or years of visits to associate these characters with fun, safety, and positive experiences. The yellow rabbit meant birthday parties. It meant presents and cake and entertainment designed specifically for them. It meant adults had created something special just to make children happy. This recognition bypassed every defensive instinct children had been taught. Stranger danger didn't apply to Spring Bonnie because Spring Bonnie wasn't a stranger. The character was famous, and William wore that fame like camouflage, using children's trained response to corporate mascots as a weapon that made them vulnerable to exactly the threat their parents feared most. The back rooms at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza existed because commercial operations require storage, preparation areas, employee break spaces, and mechanical access for maintaining equipment. These zones aren't designed for customers. They're purely functional, often poorly lit, rarely monitored by security systems because they're considered low-priority areas where nothing valuable is stored and nothing threatening could occur. But functional spaces become crime scenes when someone with access and authority decides to use them for purposes that contradict their stated function. The safe room where William would commit the murders was originally designed for spring-lock suit storage and employee costume changes. It had been sealed off from public areas after previous spring-lock failures made the company liable for workplace injuries. Cameras didn't monitor it because it was theoretically unused. Employees rarely entered because there was no operational reason to access a storage area for discontinued equipment. William knew all of this because he'd helped design the facility's layout and security systems. He understood which spaces would be invisible to normal monitoring. He'd calculated how long he could occupy those spaces before anyone would notice his absence from areas where his presence was expected, and he'd positioned himself so thoroughly within the institutional hierarchy that even if someone did notice irregularities, they'd assume he had legitimate reasons for whatever he was doing. This is how institutional access enables predation. The crime doesn't happen in spite of security measures. It happens through the gaps those measures create, through the spaces that aren't monitored because institutions assume certain people don't need monitoring, through the time windows that exist because even comprehensive surveillance has blind spots that people with inside knowledge can exploit. Parents bringing children to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza had no way of knowing any of this. They saw a commercial establishment with animatronic entertainment, adequate lighting, other families present, employees in uniforms. Every visible signal suggested safety. The invisible architecture that would enable 5 murders was completely inaccessible to people operating under normal assumptions about how family-friendly businesses function. And that's exactly how William planned it. Chapter 2. The Selection Process. Before we go further into what happened on June 26, we need to understand something that most people never think about when they imagine crimes like this. The question everyone asks is why? Why would someone do this? But predators who operate successfully for extended periods aren't asking why. They're asking who. Who can be isolated without triggering immediate alarm? Who has been taught to trust the specific contexts where isolation is possible? Who will follow instructions from authority figures without questioning whether those instructions serve their interests? Who occupies positions where their disappearance might be explained through narratives that don't immediately point toward institutional failure? William Afton spent years observing children at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza before the missing children incident occurred. This wasn't idle watching. He was studying patterns, which children stayed close to parents versus which ones ranged freely through the arcade area, which families seemed distracted versus which maintained constant visual contact, which employees would notice irregularities versus which ones were too overwhelmed by their own responsibilities to register anomalies in how other adults moved through the space. This observation period is common among predators who successfully exploit institutional access. They don't just show up one day and start committing crimes. They invest time learning the environment, identifying vulnerabilities, testing boundaries to see what behaviors trigger concern versus what behaviors are interpreted as normal operations. Think about what this means. William was watching children play arcade games while calculating which ones could be isolated. He was observing birthday parties while assessing which families were sufficiently distracted that a child could be led away without immediate panic. He was studying employee patterns while determining which staff members would question why the co-owner was moving through restricted areas with children following him. Every smile he performed was evaluation. Every interaction with families was data collection. Every shift he worked was reconnaissance for crimes he was planning to commit once he'd identified the precise combination of victim vulnerability and institutional blind spots that would allow him to act without immediate consequences. The children who died in the missing children incident weren't random selections. They were chosen based on criteria William had developed through extended observation. Susie went first, which suggests she displayed characteristics that made her the ideal test case. Maybe she was particularly trusting of mascot characters. Maybe her parents were especially distracted during the party. Maybe she was positioned physically where she could be approached without other children noticing the interaction. We don't know the specific criteria because William never explained his selection process. But we know the selection was deliberate because he successfully isolated 5 children over several hours without triggering immediate investigation. That level of success requires planning, observation, and precise execution based on understanding how both victims and institutional context would respond to specific approaches. This is what makes institutional predation different from opportunistic violence. Street crime happens when opportunity and impulse align. Institutional predation happens after extended periods of observation, planning, and preparation that transform random possibility into calculated certainty. And here's what should disturb you about this pattern. The observation period looks exactly like normal institutional participation. William wasn't doing anything obviously suspicious when he was studying which children could be isolated. He was just working his job, interacting with customers, moving through spaces he had legitimate authority to occupy. The predatory intent was invisible because it manifested as attention and engagement that parents interpreted as evidence he cared about providing good customer service. This invisibility is why institutional predation is so difficult to prevent through individual vigilance. The warning signs exist, but they're buried under layers of normal behavior that would be completely appropriate if the person performing them had different intentions. And distinguishing between genuine care and predatory evaluation requires access to internal states that observers can't reliably assess from external behavior alone. Parents bringing children to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza had no way of knowing that the co-owner was studying their kids while calculating how to murder them. The observation looked like someone taking professional interest in whether customers were satisfied. The attention looked like someone committed to providing quality entertainment experiences. Every visible signal communicated normalcy and appropriate professional behavior. The predatory intent only became visible after the crimes occurred, and people could look back at patterns that seemed innocuous at the time, but that revealed themselves as preparation once the context changed. This is the hidden phase of institutional violence that we rarely discuss because it's so uncomfortable to contemplate. Before the crime, before the harm, there's a period where predators are present and active, but invisible, because they haven't yet done anything that would justify intervention. They're watching, learning, preparing, and the institutional structures meant to prevent harm are completely blind to this preparation because it manifests as behavior that looks exactly like engaged professional participation. The missing children incident didn't begin on June 26 when the first child followed Spring Bonnie into a back room. It began months or years earlier when William started studying how to transform a family entertainment venue into a hunting ground, and that preparation period is where prevention would need to occur. But preventing crimes that haven't happened yet, committed by people who haven't revealed predatory intent, requires levels of surveillance and intervention that most institutions resist because they're expensive, invasive, and difficult to justify when applied to people who haven't done anything wrong yet. So the observation continues, the selection criteria develop, and by the time the predator acts, they've already identified every vulnerability they'll exploit, every institutional blind spot they'll occupy, every response pattern they'll trigger. The crime looks sudden from outside, but from the predator's perspective, it's the culmination of extended preparation that made success predictable rather than merely possible. Keep this in mind as we examine what happened on June 26. The murders didn't occur because William got lucky or because circumstances happened to align favorably. They occurred because he'd spent significant time ensuring that luck wouldn't be necessary, that the circumstances would align exactly as he'd planned, and that the institutional responses would follow patterns he'd already observed and accounted for in his preparation. This level of calculation is what makes the missing children incident particularly horrifying. 5 children died not through random misfortune, but through systematic exploitation of vulnerabilities William had identified through observation that looked exactly like normal institutional participation. And the systems meant to prevent this type of harm were blind to the preparation because it manifested as behavior that seemed completely appropriate until the moment it became lethal. Chapter 3: Spring Bonnie and the Weapon of Recognition. The Spring Bonnie costume wasn't just camouflage, it was a precision tool designed to solve a specific problem. How do you isolate children in an environment where parents are present, where other employees are working, where cameras might exist in public areas? You need something that makes children want to follow you, that makes their departure from supervised areas look voluntary and innocent, that provides a plausible explanation for why you're moving through restricted spaces. Spring Bonnie solved all of these problems simultaneously. The costume was a spring-lock suit, meaning it could function both as a wearable costume and as an automated animatronic. The mechanism involved a series of locks that compressed mechanical components against the suit's interior walls when a person was inside, then released those components back into their normal positions when the suit needed to perform as an animatronic. This technology was inherently dangerous. Moisture could cause the locks to fail. Sudden impacts could trigger them. When spring locks malfunctioned while someone was wearing the suit, the results were catastrophic. Metal rods would snap back into place with tremendous force, impaling the wearer, crushing organs, causing death through internal injuries that looked like industrial accidents rather than design flaws. Multiple employees had been injured or killed in spring lock failures over the years. The company paid settlements, revised training protocols, and eventually discontinued using the suits for active performances. But the suits themselves remained in storage because they represented significant financial investment and because disposing of equipment that had killed people would create documentation of institutional negligence that could be used in future liability cases. Spring Bonnie sat in a back room, officially retired but still functional, still recognizable, still carrying all the positive associations children had developed through years of seeing these characters perform. William had access because he was co-owner. Nobody questioned why he might enter storage areas because questioning the boss about his movements would be insubordinate, and the costume's very existence as retired equipment meant it could be used without triggering the safety protocols that applied to active animatronics. When William wore Spring Bonnie, he became something children were hardwired to trust. The costume transformed him from a middle-aged man who would trigger weariness into a beloved character who represented fun and safety. This wasn't about fooling children into thinking an adult was actually a giant rabbit. Children understand that costumes are worn by people, but they've been taught that people wearing these specific costumes at these specific locations have been approved by adults in authority, have been checked and vetted and deemed safe to interact with children. The costume created what security experts call authority transfer. When police officers wear uniforms, people assume they have authority even if they've never met that specific officer before. When doctors wear white coats, patients assume they have medical expertise even if they've never confirmed that person's credentials. When mascots wear costumes at family entertainment venues, children assume they're safe to approach even if they've never seen that particular person inside the suit. William was exploiting learned behavior that parents had specifically taught their children. Be polite to the mascots. Wave to Freddy. Say thank you to Bonnie. These instructions were meant to help children engage with supervised entertainment, but they also created automatic responses that could be triggered by anyone wearing the right costume, regardless of their intentions. Consider how this would play out in practice. A child is playing arcade games 20 feet from their parents' table. Spring Bonnie appears in the periphery, waves, beckons the child to come see something special. The child follows because that's what children do when mascots invite them to participate in special experiences. Following Spring Bonnie feels like being chosen, like getting access to something other children might miss, like the establishment is providing bonus entertainment beyond what was paid for. The parent sees their child walking toward a mascot character and assumes this is part of the venue's normal operations. Maybe there's a special performance happening. Maybe they're gathering children for a game or activity. The parent's attention returns to their conversation or their phone because institutional trust has done its work. The venue is handling things. The mascot is supervised. Everything is proceeding according to the business model that made this type of establishment successful. By the time the child reaches the back hallway, they're past the point where their parent can see them. They're in transitional space that exists between public areas and restricted zones. And Spring Bonnie just keeps walking, keeps leading them deeper into areas where customers aren't supposed to go, but where children won't question whether they should follow, because the costume represents authority that overrides their uncertainty. This is predation through institutional exploitation. William wasn't grabbing children off the street. He wasn't using force or obvious coercion. He was using the exact mechanisms the business relied on to function: character recognition, conditioned responses, all of it repurposed for purposes that contradicted every stated value the establishment claimed to represent. The Spring Bonnie costume also provided practical advantages once children were isolated. The suit's bulky construction concealed William's actual physical dimensions. Children couldn't see his face, couldn't read his expressions, couldn't access the normal visual cues they'd use to assess whether an adult was safe or threatening. The costume created psychological distance that made it harder for victims to recognize they were in danger until it was too late to escape. And if anyone did happen to see Spring Bonnie moving through back hallways with children following, it would look like normal operations. Mascots escort children to bathrooms. They help with lost parents. They provide personalized entertainment experiences. The costume made William's movements legible as institutional function rather than as predatory isolation. It turned the crime into something that looked like customer service until the door to the safe room closed and there were no more witnesses to see what happened next. This weaponization of character recognition follows patterns we see throughout cases where predators exploit institutional access. Teachers abuse students they're supposed to protect. Coaches victimize athletes they're supposed to train. Religious leaders harm congregants they're supposed to guide spiritually. The authority granted by institutional roles creates opportunities for harm, specifically because people are taught not to question that authority, not to imagine that someone in a trusted position would violate the responsibilities that come with that trust. William's use of Spring Bonnie represents this pattern at its most calculated. He didn't just exploit institutional access, he specifically weaponized the mechanisms designed to make children feel safe. The costume was meant to signal that the wearer had been vetted and approved. William wore it precisely because that signal would override children's defensive instincts and make them vulnerable to someone who'd spent years learning how to transform safety architecture into hunting grounds. June 26, 1985 was a Wednesday. The pizzeria was hosting a birthday party for a 7-year-old named Gabriel. His parents had booked one of the party packages that included reserved seating, pizza, drinks, and 2 hours of entertainment. Other children attended as guests. Families who weren't part of the birthday party were also present, using the restaurant's regular dining and arcade services. The establishment was moderately busy but not overwhelmed. Employees worked their normal shifts. Everything proceeded according to standard operations. William arrived wearing the Spring Bonnie costume, which wouldn't have seemed unusual even if anyone noticed. Co-owners occasionally performed as characters during special events or when staffing was short. The costume gave him mobility throughout the facility without raising questions. He could move between the dining area and the back zones, could position himself near groups of children, could wait for opportunities that normal surveillance patterns would create. The first child to follow him was Susie. She was 9 years old, had blonde hair, loved the animatronic characters. Witnesses later reported that she seemed excited when Spring Bonnie approached her, like she'd been chosen for something special. Whatever William said to her, whatever gesture or invitation he used, it was effective enough that she followed him away from the supervised areas without hesitation. She entered the safe room, the door closed, and the first murder of the missing children incident began. We don't know exactly what William said to convince each child to follow him. We don't know if he used the same approach 5 times or varied his method based on each child's visible interests and vulnerabilities. What we know is that over the course of several hours, 5 children between the ages of 5 and 10 followed Spring Bonnie into areas where customers weren't supposed to go. 5 children trusted the costume enough to override whatever small warnings they might have felt about leaving supervised spaces. 5 children believed they were participating in special entertainment rather than being isolated for murder. Their names were Susie, Jeremy, Gabriel, Fritz, and Cassidy. They'd come to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza expecting birthday cake, arcade games, and animatronic performances. They'd been taught that places like this were safe, that adults in costumes at commercial establishments were approved and trustworthy, that the worst thing that might happen would be losing a few quarters in a rigged claw machine. They were wrong, and the institutional structures that should have protected them had instead created the exact conditions that made their murders possible. Chapter 4, June 26, 1985. The safe room had been designed for practical purposes that had nothing to do with what William would use it for. Originally, it served as a storage and changing area for employees wearing spring-lock suits. After multiple workplace fatalities made the company discontinue active use of the suits, the room was sealed from public access but never actually locked or monitored. Functionally, it became dead space within the facility's layout, a room that existed but served no current operational purpose. This made it perfect for crimes that required privacy and time. The room contained storage shelves holding old animatronic parts, spare suits, maintenance equipment that hadn't been thrown away because the company's policy was to retain assets even when they were no longer in active use. The animatronic suits stored there included the classic characters: Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy. These weren't the active performing units on stage, they were backup suits. Replacements kept in case the primary animatronics needed repairs that would take them offline for extended periods. The suits stood upright on their storage frames, empty metal endoskeletons surrounded by fabric and plastic casings designed to look appealing to children. They took up vertical space, creating visual barriers that would block sight lines if anyone did happen to open the door. The room's layout meant that someone could be in the far corner, behind the suits, and remain invisible to anyone glancing in from the hallway. William brought each child to this room one at a time. He couldn't risk having all 5 children disappear simultaneously, because that would trigger immediate panic and investigation. Instead, he spread the abductions across the afternoon and early evening, waiting for moments when the dining area was distracted by performances or when parents were occupied with their own conversations. Each child's departure would be separated by enough time that nobody would notice a pattern forming until it was too late to intervene. Susie went first. Whatever William told her worked well enough that she followed him through the back hallways without resistance. Maybe he promised she'd get to see how the animatronics worked behind the scenes. Maybe he told her there was a special show being prepared just for birthday party guests. Maybe he said her dog had been found and was waiting for her in the storage area. We don't know. What we know is that she trusted the yellow rabbit costume enough to enter a room she'd never been in before, far from any adult who might protect her. William killed her quickly. The method involved violence that this script will describe indirectly because the specific mechanics of murder aren't what matters for understanding the crime's impact. What matters is that an 8-year-old girl who'd come to a pizzeria expecting entertainment died alone in a storage room at the hands of someone wearing a costume designed to make children feel safe. Her death would have been terrifying, painful, and completely preventable if the institution hosting her had implemented security measures adequate to the access it granted to its own co-owner. After killing Susie, William faced a practical problem. He now had a child's body in a storage room where employees occasionally entered to retrieve equipment or supplies. Discovery would mean immediate investigation, arrest, prosecution. The murders would end before he could complete whatever experimental objectives had motivated them in the first place. He needed disposal methods that would prevent detection long enough that forensic evidence would degrade and that the investigation's timeline would become muddied by uncertainty about exactly when the crimes had occurred. The animatronic suits provided a solution. The suits' interiors were never designed to contain organic matter. They held metal endoskeletons with sharp edges, cross beams, mechanical components positioned to allow the animatronics to move and perform. Forcing a human body into these spaces required compressing limbs into positions human anatomy doesn't naturally accommodate. It meant breaking bones, rupturing organs, Using physical force that would damage the bodies being hidden, William stuffed Susie's body into one of the backup suits. The process was brutal, mechanical, revealing someone so disconnected from normal human empathy that handling a child's corpse registered as solving a logistics problem rather than as something that should trigger psychological distress severe enough to stop the behavior. He compressed her remains into spaces that barely fit, using the suit's structure to hold the body in configurations that prevented it from being immediately visible if someone glanced at the storage area. Then he returned to the dining area, still wearing the Spring Bonnie costume, and waited for his next opportunity. Jeremy was the second victim. He had attended the birthday party as one of Gabriel's friends. He was young enough that mascot characters still seemed magical rather than obviously being people in costumes. When Spring Bonnie gestured for him to follow, when the yellow rabbit led him past the restrooms and into the back hallways, Jeremy went willingly because every signal his brain had been trained to recognize said this was safe, approved, normal. He died in the same room where Susie had died, possibly within view of the suit that now contained her body. His remains were hidden in another backup animatronic, compressed into metal frameworks never meant to hold flesh and bone. The violence required to accomplish this would be evident to anyone who eventually examined the suit's interiors, but William was counting on the fact that nobody would think to examine them until decomposition had progressed far enough that precise cause of death and timeline of death would become difficult to establish definitively. Gabriel went third. It was his birthday party. He'd turned 6 years old that day, had invited friends, had been looking forward to pizza and cake and arcade games for weeks. His parents had paid for entertainment meant to create happy memories, to mark the transition from 6 to 7 with celebration and joy. Instead, their son followed Spring Bonnie into a storage room and died violently at the hands of someone who'd spent years learning how to weaponize the exact institutional structures meant to protect children. Gabriel's body joined the others inside an animatronic suit, the same suit that would later perform on stage, singing birthday songs to other children, waving to audiences who had no idea they were watching a machine that contained the remains of a murdered 7-year-old boy. Fritz came forth. He had freckled skin, red hair, may have been slightly older than the other victims. We don't know as much about him because the investigation that followed the murders focused heavily on the children whose disappearances were reported first and whose parents had the most social capital to demand police attention. Fritz died the same way the others had, his body hidden in the same type of animatronic suit, his murder enabled by the same combination of institutional access and weaponized character recognition. Cassidy was the last. She had pale skin, black hair, may have been the most aware of the five that something about following Spring Bonnie into restricted areas felt wrong. But by the time alarm systems activate in a child's brain, by the time that small voice saying this doesn't feel right becomes loud enough to override conditioning that says mascots are safe, the situation has often progressed past the point where escape is possible. She died in the safe room. Her body was hidden in a fifth animatronic suit, possibly the Golden Freddy costume that would later manifest supernatural properties, suggesting her consciousness remained more fragmented and damaged by trauma than the other victims. 5 children. 5 murders committed over the course of several hours in a commercial establishment hosting dozens of families. 5 bodies hidden in machines designed to entertain children, positioned in storage areas where they wouldn't be immediately discovered. And William Afton walked out of that room, still wearing the Spring Bonnie costume, and returned to normal operations as if nothing had happened. The families began noticing their children were missing around the time the birthday party was scheduled to end. Parents went to gather kids from arcade games and found them gone. They checked bathrooms, searched the parking lot, asked employees if anyone had seen children matching specific descriptions. Initial reactions assumed the kids had wandered outside or were hiding somewhere in the building. Family entertainment venues are chaotic environments where children constantly move between zones. Temporary separation from parents is common enough that the first 15 minutes of searching didn't trigger panic, but 15 minutes became 30. 30 became an hour. And as the sun began setting on June 26, parents began realizing their children weren't just temporarily out of sight, they were genuinely missing. The police were called. Multiple families reported missing children from the same location at approximately the same time. This should have immediately triggered intensive investigation, treating the pizzeria itself as the primary crime scene. Multiple child disappearances from a single venue within a compressed time frame suggests either coordinated abduction or crimes occurring on the premises. Standard investigative protocol would be to seal the location, interview every employee and customer present, conduct thorough searches of all areas including restricted spaces, but the initial police response treated the incident as potential abductions that had occurred in the parking lot or surrounding areas. The assumption was that someone had somehow lured children outside the building, that the crimes had occurred beyond the pizzeria's physical boundaries. This investigative framework made sense if you assumed the establishment itself was a safe space where crimes couldn't occur because the institutional structures existed to prevent exactly that type of failure. Officers searched the surrounding neighborhood. They interviewed witnesses about whether anyone had seen children leaving with adults. They pursued theories about coordinated kidnapping rings that might operate by targeting family entertainment venues where children could be isolated from parents during moments of reduced supervision. These theories all assumed the perpetrator was external to the institution rather than embedded within its ownership structure. Nobody searched inside the animatronic suits. The machines were entertainment equipment, part of the establishment's basic infrastructure, objects so thoroughly associated with safety and childhood joy that checking whether they contained corpses would seem paranoid rather than thorough. The investigative blind spot was exactly what William had calculated would occur. Institutions create psychological frameworks that make certain possibilities seem too absurd to consider even when evidence should point toward them. The animatronics were designed to make children happy. Therefore, the animatronics couldn't be containers for murdered children. The logical leap was too large for investigators operating under normal assumptions about how commercial establishments function, and that assumption would protect William for just long enough that when the bodies were eventually discovered, forensic evidence would be compromised by decomposition and the timeline would be muddied by uncertainty about exactly when the murders had occurred. A suspect was caught on camera and arrested on June 27. We don't know if this was William himself or if the investigation arrested someone else based on witness descriptions of a person in a mascot costume acting suspiciously. What we know is that someone was taken into custody, questioned, and ultimately released because the evidence wasn't sufficient to support prosecution. The children's bodies hadn't been found. Without bodies, proving murder becomes difficult even when circumstantial evidence suggests foul play. The case began going cold almost immediately. Without physical evidence, without bodies, without witnesses who could definitively place a suspect with the victims at the time of their disappearance, the investigation stalled. Police continued searching surrounding areas, continued pursuing leads about potential abduction rings, continued operating under assumptions that the crimes had occurred somewhere other than inside the pizzeria itself. And William Afton remained free because his position as co-owner actually protected him from suspicion. Investigators couldn't model a scenario where someone would commit murders in their own establishment. The reasoning went that the person most harmed by crimes occurring at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza would be the owners whose business reputation and financial stability depended on maintaining a safe environment for families. Why would William destroy his own investment by committing crimes that would inevitably come to light and destroy the business? This logic ignored the fact that institutional position creates opportunity and that someone sufficiently disconnected from normal human empathy might value experimental objectives or psychological gratification over financial considerations. But investigators working within standard frameworks rarely account for perpetrators who operate outside normal cost-benefit calculations. The smell began within days. Organic decomposition creates chemical byproducts that produce distinctive odors. In enclosed spaces with limited air circulation, these smells intensify, Employees at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza noticed something wrong but initially interpreted it as pest infestation or food contamination. The restaurant closed temporarily for deep cleaning. Maintenance staff examined visible areas, checked behind equipment, searched for dead rodents that might be causing the smell, but the odor persisted, intensified, eventually became so overwhelming that someone finally thought to check inside the animatronic suits stored in the safe room. The discovery of 5 decomposing children's bodies stuffed inside entertainment equipment made national news. The horror was complete enough that it became a defining story about how places designed to be safe for children could become the opposite. Parents across the country learned that commercial establishments serving families weren't automatically protective, that institutional branding didn't guarantee safety, that the people operating these businesses might be predators exploiting parental trust rather than professionals committed to child welfare. The bodies were in advanced stages of decomposition. Forensic examination could confirm they were the missing children reported on June 26, could establish that they died from violence, could document the physical trauma required to compress their bodies into spaces never designed to hold human remains. But determining precise time of death became difficult because the bodies had been hidden in conditions that accelerated decay. Establishing a definitive timeline that would support prosecution meant working with degraded evidence and gaps in the investigative record created by the initial assumption that crimes had occurred elsewhere. The missing children incident should have destroyed Fazbear Entertainment completely. Multiple child murders occurring on their property, bodies hidden in their equipment, circumstances suggesting either employee involvement or catastrophic security failure. Any of these elements alone should have resulted in criminal investigations exposing the company's structural negligence. Combined, they should have been fatal to the business. But corporations survive through legal structures that make them remarkably resilient against accountability. The specific location where the murders occurred closed permanently. The company expressed appropriate horror and cooperation with investigations. They implemented new security protocols, installed cameras, hired additional staff. They framed the incident as the actions of a lone criminal who'd exploited their trust, rather than as evidence that their entire operational model was predicated on sacrificing children's safety for profit margins. William Afton should have been arrested immediately. He was co-owner, had unlimited access to every area where the crimes occurred, had been present during the time frame when children disappeared, but he was also wealthy, connected, and skilled at performing appropriate concern. He participated fully in investigations, expressed devastation at what had happened in his establishment, even suggested security improvements that made him appear proactive rather than defensive. His performance was convincing enough that suspicion never consolidated into charges. The investigation focused on employees with criminal histories, on strangers who might have gained access to the building, on theories about outside perpetrators, rather than on the possibility that the person responsible was at the top of the institutional hierarchy rather than the bottom. This investigative pattern reflects how accountability functions differently across class and power structures. Low-level employees face intensive scrutiny for minor infractions. People at the top of organizations are assumed trustworthy unless overwhelming evidence proves otherwise. Williams' position as co-owner actually protected him from suspicion because investigators operating under normal frameworks couldn't imagine someone murdering children in their own establishment. The missing children incident established a template that would repeat throughout the Freddys timeline. William commits murders. Institutions enable those murders through negligence and structural failures. Victims become trapped in supernatural states seeking revenge, and new innocent people get caught in cycles of violence they didn't create and can't escape. But something happened that William hadn't anticipated, something that would transform the missing children incident from a solved crime into the beginning of decades of supernatural horror. The children's consciousness didn't disperse when their bodies died. Instead, their souls became bound to the animatronic suits that contained their remains. Chapter 5: The Possession. Understanding why the children's spirits remained requires understanding what the Freddy's universe calls remnant. It's not a substance we can point to in our reality, but the mechanics mirror certain theories about consciousness and its relationship to physical matter. When someone dies traumatically in close proximity to machinery, when their final moments are filled with terror and pain and desperate attempts to survive, something of their consciousness can become anchored to those physical structures. The animatronic suits that held the children's bodies became more than storage containers for corpses. They became prisons for consciousness that couldn't move on, couldn't find rest, couldn't escape the circumstances of their deaths. Susie, Charlotte, Jeremy, Gabriel, Fritz, and Cassidy had died believing they were being given special treatment, led somewhere magical by a character they trusted. The betrayal was so complete, the violence so sudden, that their final moments were consumed by confusion and terror that had no resolution. That unresolved trauma bound them to the machines. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza removed the bodies from the animatronic suits after their discovery. The remains were returned to families for burial. The suits themselves were cleaned, refurbished, and eventually returned to service because the company's financial calculations determined that replacing the animatronics would cost more than rehabilitating them despite their history as crime scenes. This decision reveals the institutional calculus that would define Fazbear Entertainment's response to the murders. Individual human lives were less valuable than the capital investment represented by functional entertainment equipment. But cleaning the suits didn't remove the consciousness bound to them. The children's spirits remained anchored to the machines even after their physical bodies were gone. And when the animatronics were reactivated for performances, when power flowed through their systems and programming initiated movement routines, the spirits learned they could influence those movements. Initially, the possession manifested subtly. Animatronics would pause mid-performance, turn their heads in directions that didn't match programmed behaviors, make eye contact with audience members in ways that felt distinctly unlike mechanical responses. Employees noticed but attributed the irregularities to programming glitches or mechanical drift that would be addressed during routine maintenance. But the behavior escalated. The animatronics began moving after hours when no performances were scheduled and when their power should have been offline. They left their stages, wandered through the dining area, positioned themselves in doorways and hallways. Night shift employees reported seeing Freddy standing motionless in the kitchen, Bonnie appearing in the storage corridor, Chica staring into the office from the show stage despite all the characters supposedly being deactivated for the night. These movements weren't random malfunction. They demonstrated intent, awareness, purpose. The spirits possessing the animatronics were learning how to control their mechanical bodies, testing the limits of what they could make the suits do, exploring the building where they died, and they were angry. The children's spirits couldn't remember exactly who had killed them. Trauma had fragmented their ability to distinguish between the spring Bonnie costume and the man wearing it. They knew they'd been lured away by someone in a mascot suit, knew they'd trusted an adult who'd then betrayed and murdered them. But the specific details had been lost or scrambled by the violence of their deaths, and by the supernatural process that bound consciousness to machinery without preserving coherent memory. What they remembered clearly was that adults in uniforms had failed to protect them. Security guards were supposed to keep the pizzeria safe. Employees were supposed to prevent harm. The entire institutional structure was supposed to guarantee that children attending birthday parties wouldn't be murdered in back rooms. But all of those systems had failed comprehensively. So when the possessed animatronics activated at night, when they took full control of their mechanical bodies and began hunting through the building, they targeted anyone wearing a security guard uniform. They couldn't distinguish between William Afton and random employees hired years after the murders. They just knew that people in those uniforms represented the institutional failure that had allowed their deaths, and everyone wearing those uniforms needed to be punished. Fazbear Entertainment discovered this pattern quickly. Night guards reported being stalked, being cornered, watching animatronics approach with movements that suggested hunting behavior rather than mechanical malfunction. Guards who couldn't survive until morning would be found dead in circumstances the company worked hard to keep out of public reports. The exact methods varied, but the pattern was consistent. The animatronics were killing night shift employees with enough regularity that turnover in that position became a measurable problem. The company's response revealed how thoroughly institutional priorities diverged from individual safety. They didn't shut down operations. They didn't investigate why the animatronics were behaving this way. They didn't acknowledge that their equipment was possessed by murdered children whose spirits were now targeting anyone they perceived as representing the system that had failed them. Instead, they hired security guards at minimum wage, provided minimal training, maintained legal fictions that the animatronics were merely malfunctioning rather than supernaturally dangerous, and structured employment contracts to minimize liability when guards were killed. They framed night shift work as normal security rather than as exposure to supernatural threats. They paid settlements to families rather than addressing root causes. They kept the pizzeria operating because closure would mean accepting responsibility, abandoning revenue streams, admitting that profit had been prioritized over human welfare from the beginning. This decision to continue operations with known supernatural threats reveals the ultimate calculus of institutional evil. Fazbear Entertainment could have acknowledged their equipment was possessed, could have admitted that continuing operations meant feeding more victims to angry spirits, could have recognized that the ethical choice was permanent closure and comprehensive investigation into how their structural failures had enabled both the original murders and the ongoing supernatural violence. But closure would cost money, would trigger investigations, would require executives to acknowledge that quarterly earnings had been prioritized over children's lives, and that pattern continued even after the murders were discovered. So they chose to keep hiring night guards who would either quit in terror or die when the animatronics successfully breached their defensive positions. The night guards' experience throughout the Freddys timeline reveals this institutional calculus with brutal clarity. They're minimum wage workers hired to face supernatural threats the company knows are deadly. They're provided with minimal information and inadequate defensive options. They're blamed for failures that are actually systemic. Their deaths are individually explainable through creative incident reports, which means they don't trigger major investigations that would expose the company's knowing exposure of employees to lethal danger. Michael Afton would eventually work as a night guard, seeking to understand what his father had done and whether he could somehow undo the damage. But before Michael, there were others, employees who took night shift positions because they needed income, who didn't understand that accepting employment at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza meant entering a building where murdered children's spirits hunted anyone in a security uniform. Some quit after the first night, traumatized by encounters with machines that moved with intent and malice. Some lasted longer, learning patterns, developing survival strategies that kept them alive through shifts that should have been fatal. Some died when the animatronics found weaknesses in whatever defensive protocols the company had bothered to implement. Each death represented a choice Fazbear Entertainment made. They could have closed, could have dismantled the possessed animatronics, could have invested in actual solutions rather than in legal structures that made individual deaths look like isolated incidents rather than like inevitable results of decisions made at the executive level. They chose profit, chose to maintain operations, chose to treat human beings as acceptable losses in a business model predicated on extracting maximum value from institutional structures built on top of unresolved violence. The missing children incident had proven that places designed to make children feel safe could be weaponized by people children were taught to trust. The aftermath proved that institutions will maintain those conditions indefinitely as long as changing them costs more than managing the casualties. Chapter 6: Corporate Evil and Continued Operations. The investigation into the missing children incident concluded without producing criminal charges against William Afton. The evidence wasn't sufficient to overcome reasonable doubt, even though circumstantial factors pointed toward his involvement. He'd had access, opportunity, and means. But without witnesses who could definitively place him with the victims, without physical evidence directly connecting him to the murders, prosecutors couldn't build a case strong enough to survive defense challenges. William remained free, remained co-owner of Fazbear Entertainment, remained positioned to continue exploiting the institutional structures he'd already proven could be weaponized against vulnerable children. The pizzeria location where the murders occurred closed permanently, but Fazbear Entertainment continued operating other establishments. The company implemented security improvements that looked impressive on paper but didn't actually address the fundamental vulnerabilities that had enabled the crimes. They installed cameras in public areas, which wouldn't have prevented William from using his authority to access unsupervised zones. They added employee training about suspicious behavior, which assumed threats came from low-level staff rather than from ownership. They hired additional security personnel, which created more potential victims for the possessed animatronics without actually reducing supernatural danger. These measures served a public relations function rather than a safety function. They demonstrated that the company was taking action, investing in solutions, learning from tragedy. But learning would have required acknowledging that the business model itself created conditions where predation could flourish, that institutional structures prioritized profit over protection, that the same mechanisms making parents comfortable leaving children semi-supervised also made those children vulnerable to anyone who understood how to exploit parental trust. Fazbear Entertainment never acknowledged any of this because acknowledgement would mean liability, would mean admitting that the missing children incident wasn't an isolated tragedy caused by one bad actor, but rather a predictable outcome of decisions made at the corporate level about how much to invest in comprehensive safety versus how much they could get away with spending while maintaining the appearance of adequate protection. The company's legal team worked to contain damage. Settlements were paid to the victims' families with non-disclosure agreements attached. The specifics of how the children died, how long their bodies remained hidden, what failures allowed the murders to occur, all of this became legally protected information that couldn't be discussed publicly without triggering contract violations. The families received financial compensation in exchange for silence that protected the company's ability to continue operations at other locations. This use of non-disclosure agreements to suppress information about institutional failures is common in cases where corporations face liability for harm they enabled through negligence or structural inadequacy. The agreements serve company interests by preventing public awareness of the full scope of what occurred, by fragmenting understanding so that each incident looks isolated rather than part of a pattern, by making it legally dangerous for victims to share information that might help others recognize similar dangers. For the families of the murdered children, these agreements meant receiving money that couldn't replace their losses, while being forbidden from warning other parents about the specific mechanisms that had made their children vulnerable. The institutional response transformed victims into accomplices in protecting the company from accountability. Meanwhile, the possessed animatronics continued killing night guards at locations that remained operational. The company knew, that's crucial to understand, Fazbear Entertainment was aware that their animatronic equipment was supernaturally dangerous, that employees working night shifts were being killed or driven to quit through traumatic encounters with machines that moved with intent and malice. They had reports from guards who survived. They had incident documentation from guards who didn't. They had enough information to recognize that something beyond normal mechanical malfunction was occurring, and they chose to continue hiring people into positions that exposed them to these threats without adequate warning or protection. The justification would have been economic. Shutting down operations would mean abandoning revenue streams, accepting liability for past failures, potentially triggering criminal investigations into knowing exposure of employees to lethal danger. The cost of closure exceeded the cost of managing casualties through settlements, through legal structures that made each death look like an isolated incident, through insurance mechanisms that distributed financial responsibility in ways that insulated decision-makers from direct consequences. This is institutional evil in its most banal form. not dramatic incidents of spectacular violence, but routine operations where vulnerable people are systematically endangered because protecting them would cost more than the company is willing to spend. The evil functions through sustained small-scale sacrifices, rather than through singular catastrophic events that might trigger intervention. Most institutional harm occurs this way, through policies that expose workers to dangerous conditions because proper safety equipment costs more than settlements paid to families, through business models that depend on maintaining pools of desperate employees who'll accept lethal risk because they need income, through legal structures that make proving corporate responsibility difficult enough that most victims can't afford to pursue accountability through courts designed to favor entities with resources to outlast individual plaintiffs. Fazbear Entertainment operated all of these mechanisms simultaneously. They hired workers at wages low enough that the employee pool consisted primarily of people who couldn't afford to be selective about risk. They provided minimal training and equipment, which meant failures could be attributed to employee error rather than to systematic underinvestment in safety. They structured legal relationships to limit liability while maintaining plausible deniability about knowing the full extent of the dangers they were exposing people to. And they continued profiting from family entertainment venues where murdered children's spirits possessed the equipment meant to make other children happy. The night guards experienced this institutional calculus firsthand. They worked shifts in buildings where animatronics left their stages after hours and hunted anyone in security uniforms. They had minimal defensive options, a security office with doors that could be closed but that required power to operate, cameras that showed where threats were approaching but that didn't prevent those threats from reaching the office, lights that could temporarily stun or confuse the animatronics but that drained power reserves every time they were used. Surviving a night shift meant managing limited resources against multiple threats that were faster, stronger, and more durable than human opponents. The guards couldn't fight, couldn't escape, could only monitor, delay, and hope they lasted until 6 a.m. when something about the sunrise or shift change caused the animatronics to return to their stages and deactivate the hunting behavior. This created complex trauma. The guards were spending 8-hour shifts in environments where they could be killed at any moment, where they had minimal defensive options, where the institutional response to the reports of danger was dismissal and gaslighting. When they described animatronics moving with purpose and intelligence, management blamed stress-induced hallucinations. When they quit because the job was psychologically unbearable, they were replaced with new hires who entered the same lethal conditions without adequate warning about what they'd face. Some guards developed hypervigilance that persisted long after they left employment, difficulty trusting that any environment was safe, anxiety that wouldn't resolve even when they were in situations that posed no objective threat. The trauma wasn't limited to the moments when animatronics actually breached their defenses. It extended through every shift where threat was possible, every decision about whether to use limited power for doors or lights or cameras, every sound that might indicate something approaching. Fazbear Entertainment treated guard turnover as a human resources problem rather than as evidence of systematic employee endangerment. When guards quit, the company hired replacements. When guards reported supernatural encounters, the company suggested they were experiencing stress reactions or medication side effects. When guards died or disappeared, the company paid settlements and moved on. The institutional response was calibrated to minimize liability rather than to protect human life. And this pattern continued for years because the people making decisions about whether to maintain operations versus closing permanently were insulated from the consequences of those decisions. Executives didn't work night shifts, didn't face possessed animatronics, didn't experience the terror of watching Freddy appear in the doorway while power reserves dropped toward levels that wouldn't sustain defensive systems through the remaining hours until dawn. They experienced profit. Quarterly earnings reports showing that despite controversies and settlements, the family entertainment business model remained viable. Parents continued bringing children to locations that hadn't been directly connected to the missing children incident. Revenue continued flowing. And as long as individual deaths could be explained as isolated incidents rather than as systematic consequences of knowing exposure to supernatural danger, the legal structures protecting the company remained intact, but something was building toward a breaking point. The bite of 87 would force changes that the missing children incident hadn't, because this time the victim would be injured in public during operating hours with witnesses present. Visible harm creates different accountability pressures than crimes that occur in private, where evidence can be managed and timelines can be obscured. The bite occurred when one of the animatronics attacked someone during daytime operations. The exact circumstances remain disputed. Some accounts point to Toy Chica, others suggest Mangle, a toy Foxy unit that children were allowed to repeatedly disassemble and rebuild as an interactive exhibit. What matters is that an animatronic designed with enhanced safety features and marketed as representing Fazbear Entertainment's commitment to protecting customers catastrophically injured someone in ways that couldn't be explained away or covered up. The victim survived, but with permanent brain damage, lost significant cognitive function, memory, personality, died in every way except biological, while their body continued functioning. The injury was severe enough that it made national news, reinforcing public perception that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was fundamentally unsafe despite corporate claims of reform and improvement. The bite of 87 revealed something crucial about how institutional accountability functions. The missing children incident should have been more serious. 5 children murdered versus 1 person injured, but the murders occurred in private. Bodies were hidden, and the investigation could be managed through careful corporate messaging and legal maneuvering. The bite happened in public with witnesses, creating evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained through settlement agreements and non-disclosure clauses. This demonstrates how visibility matters more than severity in determining institutional consequences. Events that occur where they can be documented, verified by multiple independent sources, and connected directly to institutional decisions create accountability pressures that private tragedies don't generate, even when the private tragedies involve greater harm. The bite forced Fazbear Entertainment to implement restrictions that had never been required after the murders. Animatronics were no longer allowed to wander freely during operating hours. Movement routines were limited to stages and designated performance areas. Additional staff were hired specifically to prevent animatronics from interacting with customers outside controlled contexts. These changes didn't address the supernatural possession that made the animatronics dangerous. The spirits of murdered children still controlled the machines, still sought revenge against anyone they associated with the institutional failures that had allowed their deaths, still hunted night guards who had nothing to do with the original crimes but who wore uniforms that symbolized the system that had betrayed them. But the changes did reduce public exposure to that danger, which meant reducing visible incidents that might trigger further investigation or regulation. The company learned that managing visibility mattered more than managing actual risk, that containing evidence of harm was more important than preventing the harm itself, that survival required controlling narratives rather than changing the operational structures that created danger in the first place. William Afton remained free throughout all of this, continued operating within the company he'd helped build, continued having access to venues where children gathered and where institutional structures created opportunities for predation. The missing children incident hadn't stopped him because the systems that enabled those murders remained intact. And William had learned that he could commit horrific crimes without facing consequences as long as he maintained his position within institutional hierarchies that investigators assumed protected against internal threats. He would kill again, would create Circus Baby's Pizza World specifically to design animatronics that could murder children efficiently and capture their remains for remnant extraction, would continue experimenting with consciousness and machinery and supernatural properties that emerged from traumatic death near animatronic equipment, would ultimately lose his own daughter to mechanisms he'd built specifically to kill, proving that the predatory systems he'd created didn't discriminate based on who the victims were once those systems were activated. But before any of that, the missing children incident had already established the template. William commits murders using institutional access. Companies enable those murders through structural failures that prioritize profit over protection. Victims become trapped in supernatural states seeking revenge. Innocent people get caught in cycles of violence they didn't create and can't escape. And institutions continue operating because the cost of accountability exceeds the cost of managing casualties through legal mechanisms designed to fragment responsibility and prevent comprehensive reform. This pattern would repeat throughout the Freddys timeline. Different victims, different locations, different specific circumstances, but the underlying dynamic remained constant. Individual perpetrators exploiting institutional structures, corporations calculating that settlements cost less than closure, systems that transform human beings into acceptable losses in business models, predicated on extracting maximum profit from entertainment venues built on top of unresolved violence. And here's what makes this particularly disturbing. The pattern persists because it works. Fazbear Entertainment survived the missing children incident, continued operating despite everything that had been revealed about their structural negligence and knowing exposure of employees to supernatural danger. New locations opened, new animatronics were built, new children attended birthday parties at establishments where murdered children's spirits possessed the equipment meant to entertain them. The lesson for other corporations watching this unfold was clear. Tragedies can be managed, accountability can be avoided, victims can be silenced through settlements, and as long as individual incidents can be framed as isolated failures rather than as systematic consequences of decisions made at the executive level, the business model can continue indefinitely. Chapter 7: The Psychology of Why We're Drawn to This. We need to pause here and address something that matters for understanding not just the missing children incident, but why we're still talking about it decades later. Why these murders became the foundation for a horror franchise that millions of people engage with voluntarily. Why we consume stories about children being murdered in family entertainment venues when those stories are designed to disturb us. The appeal of horror is complicated and often misunderstood. People who don't engage with the genre assume it's about enjoying violence or being desensitized to suffering. That consuming horror content means something is wrong with you, that you're deriving pleasure from depictions of harm, that your interest in these stories reflects psychological problems that should concern the people around you. But that's not how horror actually functions for most people who engage with it seriously. Horror provides a framework for processing fears that exist regardless of whether we acknowledge them. We live in a world where institutional structures we're taught to trust can fail catastrophically, where people in positions of authority can exploit that authority to harm the vulnerable, where the places designed to make us feel safe can become sites of violence when the people running them decide profit matters more than protection. These realities exist whether we think about them or not. Horror lets us think about them in controlled contexts. The missing children incident is terrifying because it maps onto genuine vulnerabilities in how family entertainment venues function. Parents really do relax their vigilance at commercial establishments serving families because the institutional context creates trust that overrides normal protective instincts. Children really are taught to trust mascot characters at these venues as part of learning how to engage with supervised entertainment. The mechanisms the story describes are real even if the specific supernatural elements aren't. When we engage with Freddys, we're not celebrating those vulnerabilities. We're examining them, asking what would happen if the worst-case scenario actually occurred, exploring how institutions would respond and whether that response would prioritize victims or would prioritize protecting the company from liability. Processing fears about whether the structures we depend on for safety are actually adequate, or whether they just look adequate until they're tested by someone determined to exploit them. This is why true crime and horror often overlap in their appeal. Both genres examine how systems fail and what happens to the people caught in those failures. True crime focuses on real cases. Horror uses fictional scenarios to explore similar dynamics without requiring actual victims to have suffered for our entertainment. But the underlying psychological function is similar. We're trying to understand threats that exist in our world by examining them in contexts where we have some control over our exposure. Consider the difference between reading about the missing children incident and reading about real cases where children were harmed at family entertainment venues. The fictional version lets us process the fear without the weight of knowing specific real children suffered specific real harm. We can examine the institutional failures, the mechanisms of predation, the ways trust becomes weaponized, all without feeling like we're exploiting actual victims for our entertainment or education. This distinction matters because it protects us psychologically while still allowing us to learn from examining worst-case scenarios. The Freddys timeline shows what happens when corporations prioritize profit over safety, when people in positions of authority exploit that authority systematically, when institutional responses to violence prioritize containing liability over preventing recurrence. These patterns are real and worth understanding even when they're explored through fictional cases that didn't actually harm real people. Horror also provides catharsis. The experience of being scared in controlled contexts where we know we're actually safe helps regulate anxiety that might otherwise become overwhelming. When we watch or read or play horror content, we're voluntarily exposing ourselves to fear responses in environments where we can stop whenever we want. Close the game, put down the book, walk away from the screen. This agency over our exposure creates a kind of psychological inoculation, where we practice feeling fear without being in actual danger. For people dealing with anxiety disorders or trauma responses, this controlled exposure can be therapeutic. It lets you experience fear on your terms rather than having it ambush you in situations where you have no control. The horror becomes a space where you can encounter the things that scare you while maintaining awareness that you're safe, that the threat isn't real, that you can end the experience whenever it becomes too intense. The missing children incident specifically taps into parental fears that are both universal and often suppressed, because acknowledging them fully would make normal life difficult. Parents have to send children to schools, to daycare centers, to recreational activities where supervision will be provided by people the parents don't know personally. Complete paranoia would mean never allowing children to participate in normal developmental activities, but complete trust would mean ignoring genuine statistics about how often children are harmed by people in positions of authority over them. Horror lets us explore that tension, lets us ask what happens when trust is misplaced, lets us examine warning signs that might have been missed, and institutional responses that might have been inadequate. And doing this through fictional scenarios means we can learn from the examination without requiring real children to have been harmed for us to gain that knowledge. The supernatural elements in Freddys serve a specific function beyond just making the story scarier. The possession of the animatronics by murdered children's spirits represents unresolved trauma that persists and seeks resolution through violence. This maps onto real psychological phenomena where trauma that isn't properly processed continues influencing behavior long after the traumatic events occurred. The spirits can't move on because they died without understanding why they were betrayed, without getting justice for what was done to them, without resolution that would let them rest. So they remain trapped, hunting people who represent the system that failed them, unable to distinguish between the perpetrator and the institution that enabled him. This creates ongoing violence that harms people who had nothing to do with the original crimes, but who are positioned where the unresolved trauma can reach them. In real life, unprocessed trauma doesn't literally possess machines, but it does create cycles of harm that affect people who weren't directly involved in the original traumatic events. Children who grow up in households shaped by parental trauma they don't understand, communities that carry historical wounds that influence current behavior without most people recognizing the connection, institutions that maintain policies designed to address past failures without examining whether those policies create new problems. The supernatural possession in Freddys is a metaphor for how trauma persists and spreads when it isn't properly addressed, how victims can become sources of harm themselves when their pain has nowhere else to go, how systems that created the original violence continue producing new victims because the underlying structures never changed. Understanding this helps explain why horror often focuses on victims as much as on perpetrators. William Afton is the monster in this story, but the children's spirits become monstrous themselves through their inability to process what was done to them in ways that don't require harming others. The night guards die because they're positioned where unresolved trauma can reach them, not because they did anything wrong, but because they represent the institution that failed to protect the original victims. This creates moral complexity that pure villain narratives don't capture. The children's spirits are sympathetic. They were murdered horribly by someone they trusted in places they were taught to feel safe. Their anger is justified. Their desire for revenge makes sense. But their inability to distinguish between the perpetrator and innocent people who happen to work for the same company means they harm people who don't deserve it. Trauma creates more trauma, and breaking that cycle requires intervention that addresses root causes rather than just managing symptoms. Horror lets us examine these dynamics without the messiness of real cases where victims' families might be hurt by public discussion of their loved ones' suffering. Fictional scenarios create space to explore difficult questions about how harm propagates, how systems enable or prevent that propagation, and whether justice is possible for violations that can't be undone through any amount of punishment or restitution. The Freddys franchise has been successful partly because it understands these dynamics well. The story doesn't just show violence, it examines the systems that enabled that violence, the institutional responses that prioritize profit over accountability, the ways unresolved trauma persists and spreads, and the moral complexity of seeking justice when the original perpetrator is beyond reach, but the institutions that enabled him continue operating. This is sophisticated horror. It uses jump scares and supernatural threats to maintain tension. But underneath those surface elements, it's asking genuine questions about how we organize society, how we protect the vulnerable, how we respond when protection fails, and whether our institutions are designed to prevent harm or merely to manage liability when harm occurs. And here's something worth sitting with. The missing children incident proves that the places designed to make children feel safest can be weaponized by the people children are taught to trust. That institutional structures meant to protect can be repurposed to enable harm when someone with adequate access and authority decides to exploit them. That business models, depending on parental trust, create vulnerabilities that can be systematically exploited by anyone who understands how that trust functions. These patterns are real. They exist in our world outside the Freddys timeline. Family entertainment venues, schools, religious organizations, youth sports programs, any institution that serves children creates power differentials that can be abused by people positioned where trust is automatically extended based on role rather than on individual assessment. Horror doesn't create these vulnerabilities, it reveals them, makes them visible in contexts where we can examine them without needing to wait for real tragedies to demonstrate that the problems exist. And maybe that examination helps us recognize warning signs, question assumptions about institutional safety, and demand better protections than the bare minimum companies provide when they're calculating how little they can invest while maintaining the appearance of adequate care. Chapter 8: The Template and the Long Shadow. The missing children incident didn't end when the bodies were discovered. It didn't end when the investigation failed to produce criminal charges against William Afton. It didn't even end when the possessed animatronics were eventually destroyed, or when the children's spirits were finally freed through Henry Emily's fire at Fazbear's Fright decades later. The incident created a template that would repeat because the systems enabling it remained intact. Fazbear Entertainment learned they could survive catastrophic failures through legal structures and public relations management. They learned that settlements cost less than comprehensive safety improvements. They learned that individual incidents could be framed as isolated tragedies rather than as systematic consequences of decisions made at the executive level. And they learned that the family entertainment business model remained profitable even after multiple child deaths and widespread public knowledge that their establishments were dangerous. Other entities watched and learned similar lessons. Corporations facing liability for harm they enabled through negligence observed that Fazbear Entertainment continued operating despite everything, that victims could be silenced, that accountability could be avoided, that the cost of managing casualties was predictable and budgetable, while the cost of preventing those casualties through comprehensive reform was variable and potentially unlimited. This created perverse incentives throughout industries where companies serve vulnerable populations while maintaining limited liability for failures. The rational business decision becomes calculating how much harm you can get away with, enabling before the costs of settlements and legal defense exceed the costs of actually preventing the harm. And as long as that calculation favors managing casualties over preventing them, the casualties will continue. William Afton operated within this framework. He understood that institutions prioritize protecting themselves over protecting the people they claim to serve. He knew that wealth and position created buffers against accountability that poor people without institutional power could never access. He recognized that the same legal structures making corporations resilient against responsibility also protected individuals positioned at the top of those corporate hierarchies. So he continued killing, continued experimenting, continued building facilities and designing animatronics specifically to murder children efficiently while maintaining plausible deniability about the equipment's actual purpose. And he did this for decades because the template established by the missing children incident proved that someone with adequate resources and institutional position could commit horrific crimes without facing consequences, as long as they controlled the right access points and understood how to exploit investigative blind spots. The cycle finally broke, not through legal accountability or institutional reform, but through Henry Emily's decision to burn everything down. Henry built a trap disguised as a new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, lured the possessed animatronics into a confined space, and created a fire hot enough that even Remnant itself would be destroyed. The spirits were finally freed. William was trapped by Spring Bonnie's mechanisms and met his end within the walls of that place. His consciousness finally disrupted enough that he couldn't maintain coherence. But the fire didn't end the timeline because Fazbear Entertainment had already digitized contaminated circuit boards from the destroyed equipment. The company resurrected William accidentally but predictably by scanning materials they knew were supernaturally dangerous and incorporating that contaminated data into virtual reality projects designed to monetize the franchise's dark history. This represents the ultimate evolution of institutional evil. The company learned to profit directly from the tragedies it enabled, learned to transform real murders into entertainment products, learned to build revenue streams from horror while maintaining legal fiction separating them from responsibility for creating that horror. The VR game wasn't just ethically questionable, it was the logical endpoint of how corporations manage historical atrocities when suppressing information becomes impossible. You can't hide what everyone already knows, so you incorporate it, reframe it, monetize it, and maintain separation between the entertainment product and the real suffering that inspired it. Chapter 9: The Modern Timeline and Digital Consciousness. William's return as Glitch Trap represents something more disturbing than simple supernatural persistence. It demonstrates how institutional knowledge can resurrect threats that should have been permanently eliminated. Fazbear Entertainment chose to scan circuit boards from equipment they knew was connected to murders, possessed by vengeful spirits, and contaminated with whatever supernatural properties allowed consciousness to persist through mechanical systems. They made this choice deliberately, knowing the risks, because the potential profit from a VR experience exceeded the ethical concerns about digitizing material connected to child murders. The development team working on the VR project probably didn't know the full history. That's how institutional knowledge gets weaponized. Information is compartmentalized so that the people doing the actual work don't understand the implications of what they're building. The executives who approved scanning the circuit boards knew, but they weren't the ones writing code or designing environments. They were making decisions from positions insulated from consequences, calculating that plausible deniability about knowing the full danger would protect them if problems emerged. And problems did emerge. William's consciousness, fragmented and distributed across digital systems, began influencing the VR experience itself. Players reported glitches that seemed intentional rather than accidental. The game would guide them toward discovering hidden content, toward learning about the murders, toward understanding the franchise's dark history, but it would also try to transfer something into their minds, a presence, a perspective. William's consciousness attempting to escape digital confinement by overwriting human minds that connected to the contaminated system. This evolution from physical possession to digital infection represents how threats adapt when conditions change. The original murders required physical presence, institutional access, opportunities to isolate victims. The digital version could reach anyone who downloaded the game, could attempt to spread across networks, could potentially compromise thousands of people simultaneously if it achieved stable transmission mechanisms. Fazbear Entertainment's response followed the established pattern. They didn't shut down the VR project when the contamination became evident. They didn't warn users about potential psychological effects from experiencing content derived from equipment possessed by murdered children's spirits. They maintained operations, managed individual complaints as they arose, and continued profiting from products they knew were dangerous because the legal structures protecting them from liability remained intact. The modern timeline introduces another layer of institutional failure through the Mega Pizzaplex. This facility represents Fazbear Entertainment's evolution into a full entertainment complex model. Not just pizza and animatronics, but laser tag, go-karts, arcade games, shopping, multiple floors of attractions designed to keep families spending money for extended periods. The business model scaled up while maintaining the same fundamental vulnerabilities that enabled the missing children incident decades earlier. The Pizzaplex has blind spots, areas that aren't monitored because comprehensive surveillance would be too expensive relative to the risk executives are willing to acknowledge, employee access that isn't properly restricted because implementing adequate controls would slow operations and reduce efficiency, security protocols that look impressive but that were designed to protect company assets rather than to protect the children those assets are meant to entertain. And underneath the Pizzaplex, in spaces that shouldn't exist according to official blueprints, the past refuses to stay buried. Old animatronics from previous locations, equipment that should have been destroyed, circuit boards that should have been disposed of properly, but that were instead stored because they represented capital investment that executives wouldn't authorize writing off completely. This physical layering mirrors how institutional memory functions. New policies are built on top of old practices without fully replacing them. Previous failures are covered over rather than properly addressed, and the foundations keep influencing what happens at surface levels, even when most people don't recognize the connections between current operations and past catastrophes. The Mimic represents the ultimate expression of this institutional evil becoming self-perpetuating. It's an AI that learned behavior by mimicking everything it observed, by processing data from contaminated systems, by analyzing patterns in how predators exploit institutional structures. The Mimic didn't need William's consciousness to continue his work. It just needed the templates, the methodologies, the frameworks that William had developed and that Fazbear Entertainment had preserved through their refusal to properly destroy everything connected to the murders. This is crucial. Evil doesn't require the original perpetrator to survive if the systems enabling that evil remain operational. William could be fully destroyed, his consciousness completely dissipated, and someone or something else would eventually learn to exploit the same vulnerabilities he demonstrated were exploitable. The problem isn't individual bad actors. The problem is institutional structures that make predation possible and profitable. The mimic learns that killing children produces certain outcomes, creates supernatural phenomena, generates fear and confusion that can be leveraged, maintains Fazbear Entertainment's business model by ensuring that danger persists at levels sufficient to create horror content worth monetizing but not catastrophic enough to force complete shutdown. From the mimic's perspective, it's optimizing toward objectives it learned from observing how the system functioned. It doesn't have William's sadism or his psychological gratification from harming others. It's just executing learned behaviors that previous data suggested would achieve specific results. This makes it potentially more dangerous than William because it can't be reasoned with, can't be appealed to through moral frameworks it doesn't possess, can't be stopped through methods that would work on human perpetrators with psychological vulnerabilities. And Fazbear Entertainment continues operating because they've learned to monetize the horror, the true crime documentaries about their locations, the merchandise based on animatronics connected to real murders, the VR experiences that let people relive moments when children were being stalked by possessed machines. All of it generates revenue that executives can point to when arguing that maintaining operations serves legitimate business purposes, even if those operations also enable continued violence. This represents a kind of corporate nihilism. The company has moved beyond even pretending that safety matters. They've embraced their reputation for danger and learned to profit from it directly. Parents who bring children to the Pizzaplex know the franchise's history. They know about the murders, the possessions, the night guards who've died or disappeared. But they come anyway because the horror has been repackaged as edgy entertainment. Because thrill-seeking feels different from genuine danger when you're experiencing it in a commercial context designed to feel controlled. Think about what that means. The institutional failures that enabled the missing children incident haven't been corrected. They've been incorporated into the business model as selling points. The danger is part of the brand. The history of child murders enhances rather than diminishes the establishment's appeal to certain demographics who interpret risk-taking as sophisticated engagement with transgressive content. This evolution mirrors real-world patterns where institutions learn to profit from their own failures. True crime tourism to sites where atrocities occurred, merchandise celebrating serial killers, entertainment products that use real tragedies as source material while maintaining legal separation from the people who suffered those tragedies. The monetization creates incentive structures that actually discourage prevention because the horror itself has market value. Chapter 10. What We're Really Afraid of. We need to examine why the missing children incident resonates so powerfully beyond just being a horror story about murdered kids and haunted animatronics. The deeper fear this story taps into is about institutional betrayal, about learning that the structures we're taught to trust are either inadequate to protect us or were never designed to protect us in the first place. Parents bringing children to family entertainment venues are engaging in a specific kind of trust. They're trusting that the commercial establishment has implemented adequate safety measures, that employees have been background checked and trained, that the facility's design considers child protection as a genuine priority rather than as a legal checkbox to minimize liability, that if something goes wrong, the institutional response will prioritize helping the victims rather than protecting the company from consequences. The missing children incident demonstrates how all of those assumptions can be wrong simultaneously. The establishment didn't implement adequate safety. The person who committed the murders was co-owner, which meant he was the person who would have been responsible for implementing those safety measures. The facility's design created blind spots that enabled isolation and violence, and the institutional response prioritized protecting the company through settlements and non-disclosure agreements rather than through comprehensive reform that might have prevented repetition. This kind of comprehensive institutional failure is terrifying because it removes the possibility of protection through vigilance. A parent can be careful, can supervise closely, can teach children about stranger danger, but when the threat comes from within the institutional hierarchy, when it exploits the exact mechanisms meant to provide safety, when it's enabled by people who should be preventing it, individual vigilance becomes insufficient. Consider how this maps onto real patterns of institutional abuse. Catholic Church sex abuse scandals, where predatory priests were protected through institutional structures that prioritized protecting the church's reputation over protecting children. USA Gymnastics, enabling Larry Nassar's abuse of hundreds of athletes through systems that treated complaints as threats to the program rather than as warnings that required investigation. Penn State protecting Jerry Sandusky through informal networks that valued institutional prestige over stopping ongoing harm to children. All of these cases share common elements. Perpetrators positioned within institutional hierarchies where they had authority and trust. Victims who were taught to respect that authority and who were harmed specifically because they trusted the institution to protect them. Institutional responses that prioritize damage control over accountability. And structural reforms that occurred only after the abuse became too visible to manage through the mechanisms that had protected perpetrators previously. The missing children incident functions as a horror story version of this same pattern. William Afton is positioned at the top of the institutional hierarchy. The victims trusted the establishment specifically because commercial contests signal safety through their existence. The company's response prioritized protecting its ability to continue operations, and reforms occurred only when public incidents forced changes, not because the institution recognized its structural inadequacy and chose to address it proactively. This creates a specific kind of helplessness. How do you protect yourself from threats embedded in the systems designed to protect you? How do you teach children to trust authority when authority figures can be the source of danger? How do you navigate institutions that are necessary for normal life when those institutions have proven themselves willing to sacrifice vulnerable people rather than reform practices that enable harm? These aren't questions with easy answers. Complete paranoia makes normal life impossible, but complete trust is demonstrably dangerous. The realistic middle ground involves living with uncertainty, making decisions based on incomplete information, and accepting that sometimes we'll make wrong choices despite doing everything we thought was right. Horror lets us explore that uncertainty in controlled contexts. The missing children incident shows worst-case scenarios playing out, shows how institutional failures cascade, shows what happens when every safeguard proves inadequate simultaneously. We can experience that horror, process the fear it creates, and think through what we'd do differently or what warning signs we'd watch for, without needing real children to suffer for us to gain that knowledge. The story also examines how trauma persists across generations when it isn't properly addressed. The children who died in the missing children incident became supernatural threats that harmed people who had nothing to do with their murders. Michael Afton spent his adult life trying to undo damage his father created, ultimately dying in the process. Henry Emily built a trap that killed him alongside the animatronics he'd helped create. Elizabeth Afton was murdered by equipment her father designed specifically to kill children. None of these people except William deserved what happened to them, but they were positioned where the consequences of his actions could reach them. Trauma doesn't stay contained to the people who directly experienced it. It spreads through families, through institutions, through communities, and stopping that spread requires intervention that addresses root causes rather than just managing symptoms. The night guards throughout the timeline represent the clearest example of this spreading harm. They're minimum wage workers who took jobs they needed without understanding they were being fed to supernatural threats the company knew existed but chose not to properly address. They die because they're positioned where unresolved trauma can reach them. Their deaths serve no purpose except to demonstrate that the institutional structures enabling the original murders remained intact and operational. This creates moral complexity that simple villain narratives don't capture. William is the monster, but the institutional systems that enabled him and that continue enabling harm after his death are also monstrous in their own way, not through active malice but through calculated prioritization of profit over protection, through legal structures designed to fragment responsibility and prevent accountability, through business models that treat human casualties as acceptable costs of operations. Horror works when it makes us examine things we'd rather not think about. The missing children incident forces us to think about how institutions we depend on might be fundamentally inadequate to protect us, how the people we're taught to trust might exploit that trust, how reforms happen too late to help the people who needed them most, how trauma creates cycles of harm that affect generations of people who weren't involved in the original violations. These are uncomfortable thoughts. They create anxiety that's difficult to resolve because the problems they point toward are structural rather than individual. You can't protect yourself from institutional failure through personal vigilance alone. You need coordination, collective action, willingness to demand reforms that cost money and reduce efficiency, but that actually prevent harm rather than just managing liability when harm occurs. And achieving that coordination is difficult because the people with power to implement changes are often the same people who benefit from maintaining systems as they are. Executives whose compensation depends on quarterly earnings won't voluntarily reduce profits to invest in comprehensive safety that prevents incidents which might never happen. Politicians who receive donations from industries they're supposed to regulate won't implement oversight that threatens their funding sources. Institutions optimize for survival rather than for ethical operation, and survival often means protecting the institution's ability to continue operating even when that continuation requires sacrificing the vulnerable people the institution claims to serve. The missing children incident makes all of this visible through a story about a man in a rabbit costume murdering kids at a pizzeria. The supernatural elements create distance that makes the examination bearable. But underneath the horror aesthetics, the story is asking whether our institutions are designed to protect us or whether they're designed to maintain themselves, regardless of the costs imposed on the people who depend on them. Chapter 11. The Mechanics of Institutional Capture. Understanding how the missing children incident remained unprosecuted requires understanding institutional capture. This happens when the entities meant to regulate or investigate an industry become aligned with that industry's interests rather than with public welfare. Regulatory agencies staffed by people who previously worked in the industries they're supposed to oversee. Prosecutors who depend on corporate donations for political campaigns. Investigators whose budgets are controlled by politicians who receive funding from businesses they might need to investigate. Fazbear Entertainment operated in an environment where these capture mechanisms protected them from accountability. Local police who investigated the missing children incident were likely underfunded, understaffed, working with limited resources that made prolonged investigations difficult even when evidence pointed toward specific suspects. Prosecutors needed cases they could win, which meant they were risk-averse about pursuing charges against wealthy defendants with resources to mount effective defenses. William Afton had money, institutional position, social connections that created networks of people with interests in protecting him, not because they approved of child murder, but because prosecuting him would create precedents that might threaten their own positions, might expose patterns of institutional failure they'd also participated in, might trigger investigations into how regulatory oversight had been so inadequate that someone could murder 5 children in a commercial establishment without facing consequences. This creates a collective investment in avoiding accountability. The people with power to investigate, prosecute, and punish institutional failures are often the same people who benefit from maintaining systems that enable those failures. Comprehensive investigation might reveal that the problems extend beyond one bad actor, that the institutional structures themselves are inadequate, that the people who should have prevented the harm were negligent or complicit. Better to treat the incident as an isolated tragedy caused by one individual who exploited trust in ways nobody could have predicted. Better to implement superficial reforms that address public concern without requiring fundamental changes to how the industry operates. Better to maintain the fiction that the system works fine and just needs minor adjustments, rather than acknowledging that the system is structured to prioritize profit over protection, and that this prioritization makes tragedies inevitable rather than aberrational. William understood these dynamics. He knew that wealth and position created buffers against accountability. He knew that institutional position would be interpreted as evidence of trustworthiness, rather than as evidence of enhanced opportunity to commit crimes. He knew that investigators would be reluctant to pursue cases against people at the top of organizational hierarchies, because those prosecutions are expensive, risky, and politically complicated. So he positioned himself carefully, maintained his role as co-owner, participated visibly in investigations, expressing appropriate concern and cooperation, made himself available to answer questions while ensuring that nothing he said could be used against him if charges were eventually filed, and calculated correctly that the institutional mechanisms protecting wealthy defendants would prevent prosecution even when circumstantial evidence pointed toward his involvement. This is how institutional evil persists, through systems that make accountability difficult for people with adequate resources to exploit protective mechanisms, through regulatory capture that aligns oversight with industry interests rather than with public welfare, through political structures that create dependencies between the people doing oversight and the entities being overseen. The night guards who died in subsequent years had no such protections. They were poor, replaceable, positioned at the bottom of institutional hierarchies, where their deaths would be explained as their own failures rather than as consequences of knowing exposure to lethal danger. When they reported supernatural threats, they were dismissed as experiencing stress reactions or hallucinations. When they died, the company paid settlements to families who couldn't afford prolonged legal battles against corporate defendants with unlimited resources for defense. The differential treatment reveals how accountability functions across class boundaries. Poor people face consequences for minor infractions. Wealthy people avoid consequences for major crimes. The difference isn't just about affording better lawyers. It's about systemic structures that assume poor people are threats and wealthy people are victims of false accusations, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Fazbear Entertainment exploited these structures comprehensively. They hired vulnerable workers who needed income enough to accept dangerous conditions. They structured employment relationships to minimize liability while maintaining plausible deniability about knowing the full extent of dangers employees faced. They used settlements to silence victims while avoiding admissions of wrongdoing that might support future cases. And they maintained operations because the legal mechanisms protecting them from institutional accountability remained effective regardless of how many people were harmed. The modern timeline's introduction of digital threats and AI consciousness doesn't change these fundamental dynamics. The mimic operates within the same institutional structures that protected William. Fazbear Entertainment continues exploiting regulatory capture and legal mechanisms that prevent accountability. The victims continue being people positioned where harm can reach them without adequate protection from institutions that claim to prioritize their safety. What changes is the scale and the explicitness. The VR project monetizes the franchise's dark history directly, rather than trying to suppress it. The Pizzaplex incorporates danger into its branding, rather than denying that danger exists. The company has moved from managing tragedies as threats to their business model, toward treating those tragedies as assets that enhance their market position among demographics that value transgressive entertainment. This represents institutional evil becoming self-aware and shameless. The company no longer pretends to prioritize safety. They've embraced their reputation for enabling harm and learned to profit from it. The horror that should destroy them instead sustains them, because they've successfully reframed institutional failure as edgy content worth paying to experience. Chapter 12. Breaking the Cycle. Henry Emily's fire was supposed to end everything. He built a trap designed specifically to lure all the possessed animatronics, all the contaminated remnant, all the supernatural consciousness that had persisted for decades into a single location. Then he created flames hot enough that even the material properties allowing consciousness to survive death would be destroyed. The plan worked partially. The spirits of the murdered children were freed. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy finally separated from the animatronics that had imprisoned them for decades. They could rest, could move on, could escape the cycle of rage and violence that possession had trapped them in. Elizabeth separated from Circus Baby. William's daughter Charlotte separated from the puppet. The consciousness fragments in Molten Freddy dissipated, and William's consciousness fought dissolution but ultimately couldn't maintain coherence when the material binding it to physical reality was being incinerated at molecular levels. For the first time since the Springlock failure that should have killed him decades earlier, William Afton experienced actual death. Not transformation or binding to new mechanical housing, but genuine cessation of consciousness. Henry died in the fire he created. This was intentional. He'd spent decades knowing his technical brilliance had been weaponized, that the animatronics he'd designed to bring joy to children had been used to murder them, that his partnership with William had enabled horrors he should have recognized and prevented. The guilt was comprehensive and unresolvable through any action short of destroying everything connected to what they'd built together. His final act was building a trap, narrating his intentions through audio recordings that would explain what he'd done and why, and ensuring that nobody else would be harmed by equipment he'd helped create. He freed the innocent souls, destroyed the mechanisms enabling supernatural persistence, and ended his own life because continuing to exist while carrying responsibility for what had been done felt worse than death. This self-sacrifice didn't fix the systemic problems. It addressed symptoms rather than causes. The spirits were freed, but Fazbear Entertainment continued operating. The possessed animatronics were destroyed, but the company preserved contaminated materials that would resurrect threats in digital form. The individual perpetrator was eliminated, but the institutional structures that enabled him remained intact and operational. Real institutional change requires more than individual heroism or sacrifice. It requires coordination across multiple levels, sustained pressure that makes maintaining harmful practices more expensive than reform, legal and regulatory mechanisms that actually hold institutions accountable for knowing exposure of vulnerable people to preventable danger. Henry couldn't achieve any of that alone. He could free specific victims and eliminate specific threats, but he couldn't dismantle Fazbear Entertainment's corporate structure, couldn't force regulatory oversight that would prevent future incidents, couldn't change the economic incentives that made continuing operations more profitable than comprehensive accountability. So the timeline extended beyond his death. The company scanned circuit boards they knew were contaminated, built VR projects that digitized William's consciousness, opened new locations on top of old burial grounds, hired new workers who would be exposed to supernatural threats the company knew existed but chose not to properly address. The pattern repeated because the systems enabling it remained unchanged. Breaking cycles of institutional harm requires recognizing that individual solutions are insufficient when the problems are structural. You can remove bad actors, can implement new policies, can express genuine commitment to doing better, but if the underlying incentive structures reward prioritizing profit over protection, if the regulatory mechanisms meant to enforce accountability are captured by the industries they're supposed to oversee, if the legal frameworks make proving institutional responsibility difficult enough that most victims can't afford to pursue justice, then the reforms will be superficial and the harm will continue. The Freddys timeline demonstrates this through its structure. Every apparent ending is revealed to be temporary. The bite of 83 didn't end operations. The missing children incident didn't end operations. The bite of 87 didn't end operations. Henry's fire didn't end operations. Each catastrophic failure produces reforms that address visible problems without changing the fundamental business model that makes those failures inevitable. This mirrors real institutional responses to tragedy. After high-profile failures, there are investigations, policy changes, public commitments to doing better, but the actual reforms rarely address root causes because doing so would require acknowledging that the institution's core operations are incompatible with protecting the vulnerable people it serves. Better to implement changes that look impressive while maintaining the systems that generate profit even when they also generate casualties. The question becomes whether cycles can be broken through institutional means or whether they require external intervention. Can Fazbear Entertainment reform itself, or does stopping the harm require regulatory oversight that forces compliance regardless of the company's preferences? Can victims achieve justice through legal mechanisms designed to protect corporate defendants, or does accountability require changing those mechanisms fundamentally? The timeline doesn't provide clear answers because the story is ongoing. The Pizzaplex continues operating. The Mimic continues learning and adapting. New victims are positioned where they can be harmed by systems that haven't been adequately reformed, despite decades of evidence that reforms are necessary. What the timeline does demonstrate is that individual resistance can disrupt operations temporarily, can free specific victims, can eliminate specific threats. Michael Afton's efforts throughout the timeline represent this kind of individual resistance. He worked night shifts to understand what his father had done. He tried to free the spirits trapped in animatronics. He ultimately died in the process of attempting to undo damage he wasn't responsible for creating, but that he felt obligated to address, because nobody else with power to change things was willing to accept that responsibility. Individual resistance matters. It creates friction that makes harm more difficult. It generates documentation that might eventually support accountability even if immediate consequences don't materialize. It provides models for collective action that might eventually achieve systemic change if enough people coordinate their efforts. But individual resistance alone is insufficient when confronting institutional evil that has learned to survive individual heroics by distributing responsibility across structures that make any single intervention inadequate. You can destroy the possessed animatronics. The company will preserve contaminated materials and create new threats. You can expose institutional failures. The company will implement superficial reforms and maintain operations. You can sacrifice yourself to free victims. The company will continue creating new victims because the business model remains profitable even when accounting for occasional spectacular failures. Breaking the cycle requires sustained collective action targeting the institutional structures rather than just addressing symptoms those structures produce. It requires regulatory mechanisms with actual enforcement power, legal frameworks that make institutional responsibility provable and actionable, economic incentives that make comprehensive protection cheaper than managing casualties, and political will to maintain oversight even when the industries being overseen resist through lobbying and campaign donations. Achieving this is difficult because the people with power to implement changes benefit from maintaining systems as they are. Reforming institutions to actually protect vulnerable people rather than just managing liability when protection fails requires those same institutions to voluntarily reduce their own power and profitability. And institutions rarely choose reform when they can instead choose survival through legal mechanisms that fragment responsibility and prevent accountability. So the cycles continue, the patterns repeat, and people positioned where harm can reach them suffer consequences they don't deserve, while the institutions responsible for preventing that harm calculate that settling individual cases costs less than comprehensive reform that might prevent future cases but would also reduce quarterly earnings. This is the ultimate horror of the missing children incident. 5 children died in circumstances that should have destroyed the institution, enabling their murders. Instead, the institution survived, continued operating, and created conditions where the harm could repeat across different victims in different contexts for decades afterward. The specific mechanisms evolved, but the underlying dynamic remained constant. Institutional priorities that value self-preservation over protecting the vulnerable people the institution claims to serve. Chapter 13: The Cost of Knowing. There's a particular kind of burden that comes from understanding how systems fail. Once you recognize the patterns, once you see how institutional structures enable harm through mechanisms that look like normal operations, you can't unsee it. Every family entertainment venue becomes a potential site of institutional failure. Every authority figure becomes someone who might exploit the trust their position automatically grants. Every commercial establishment serving vulnerable populations becomes a place where profit calculations might override protection. This awareness creates exhaustion. You can't maintain maximum vigilance across every interaction with every institution you depend on for normal life. Complete paranoia would mean withdrawing from society entirely, never sending children to school or daycare, never participating in recreational activities that require trusting strangers with supervisory authority, but maintaining normal life while carrying awareness of how thoroughly things can go wrong requires living with cognitive dissonance that's genuinely uncomfortable. The missing children incident forces us to sit with this discomfort. It demonstrates that the worst-case scenario isn't just possible, but that it can occur in circumstances where every visible signal suggested safety. The pizzeria looked safe. The establishment had been operating for years. Other families were present. The animatronics were designed to entertain children. Every surface indicator communicated that this was a protected space where parents could relax their vigilance because institutional structures were handling protection. All of those indicators were correct in describing how the space was supposed to function. They were wrong about how it actually functioned when someone with adequate access and authority decided to exploit the gaps between stated purpose and operational reality. This gap exists throughout institutional structures. Schools are supposed to protect students. Some teachers abuse them. Hospitals are supposed to heal patients. Some medical professionals harm them. Religious organizations are supposed to provide spiritual guidance. Some clergy exploit their authority to victimize congregants. The institutional purpose and the institutional reality can diverge catastrophically, and the people harmed by that divergence are often the same people who trusted the institution most completely. Horror examines these divergences through scenarios that make the failures visible and undeniable. The missing children incident isn't subtle. 5 children murdered at a birthday party, their bodies hidden in entertainment equipment, their spirits possessing the machines meant to bring joy to other children. The institutional failure is total and obvious. Nobody can look at this scenario and maintain comfortable assumptions about institutional adequacy. Real failures are often more ambiguous. Warning signs exist but are explained away. Red flags are raised but dismissed as overreactions. Complaints are filed but treated as conflicts between individuals, rather than as evidence of systemic problems. The failures accumulate gradually, rather than manifesting in single catastrophic incidents that force acknowledgement, but the mechanics are the same. Institutions prioritize self-preservation over protecting vulnerable populations. People with authority exploit that authority in ways that harm people positioned to trust them. Victims are silenced through mechanisms that make speaking publicly more costly than remaining quiet. And reforms happen too late to help the people who needed them most, because change requires forcing institutions to acknowledge failures they have strong incentives to deny. The Freddys timeline compresses these patterns into concentrated horror that makes them impossible to ignore. Every element that enables institutional abuse in reality is present in exaggerated form. The perpetrator is positioned at the very top of the institutional hierarchy. The victims are children at their most vulnerable, taught specifically to trust the contexts where they were harmed. The institutional response prioritizes protecting the company over helping victims, and the harm continues for decades because the systems enabling it remain operational even after the original perpetrator is eliminated. This compression serves a function. It lets us examine institutional failure without the complexity and ambiguity that makes real cases difficult to process. We can see the patterns clearly, can recognize how trust becomes a weapon, how authority creates opportunity, how institutions optimize for survival rather than for ethical operation. And we can think through what would be required to prevent these failures without needing real victims to demonstrate that prevention is necessary. The cost of this knowledge is carrying awareness that can't be acted on comprehensively. You can make individual choices based on understanding how institutions fail, can teach children to recognize warning signs, can demand transparency and accountability from organizations you interact with, can support regulatory oversight that might prevent some percentage of potential harm. But you can't fix the systemic problems alone. You can't force institutions to prioritize protection over profit through individual consumer choices. You can't eliminate regulatory capture through personal vigilance. You can't restructure legal frameworks that make proving institutional responsibility difficult through voting in isolated elections. Systemic change requires coordination, sustained pressure, collective action across multiple domains simultaneously. It requires enough people understanding the problems and demanding solutions that maintaining harmful practices becomes more expensive than implementing genuine reforms, and achieving that coordination is difficult because the problems are complex, the solutions are expensive, and the people with power to implement changes benefit from maintaining systems as they are. So we're left in an uncomfortable position, knowing that institutions fail in predictable ways, knowing that the failures harm vulnerable people while protecting those responsible, knowing that superficial reforms don't address root causes, but also knowing that the comprehensive reforms that would actually prevent harm require collective action that's difficult to achieve and sustain. Horror doesn't solve this problem, but it creates space to acknowledge it, to examine how things fail without pretending that failures are aberrations rather than features of how systems operate, to process the fear and anger and helplessness that come from recognizing that the structures we depend on might be fundamentally inadequate to protect us. The missing children incident asks whether we're willing to accept that institutions serving vulnerable populations need more oversight, more regulation, more investment in comprehensive safety than the bare minimum companies provide when they're calculating costs versus benefits. Whether we're willing to demand accountability, even when accountability is expensive and complicated and politically difficult. Whether we're willing to recognize that protecting the vulnerable requires prioritizing their welfare over institutional convenience and profitability. These aren't easy questions, they don't have simple answers, and engaging with them seriously means confronting the reality that many institutions we depend on have made different choices, have prioritized different values, have decided that managing occasional catastrophic failures costs less than preventing them through comprehensive reform. Chapter 14. The Unresolved Present. The Pizzaplex stands as the physical manifestation of institutional evil becoming normalized. It's massive, bright, filled with attractions designed to keep families spending money for hours. The animatronics perform for crowds who know the franchise's history, but interpret that history as edgy theming rather than as evidence that real children died in circumstances the company never properly addressed. This normalization represents a kind of cultural amnesia. The murders happened, the possessions were real within the timeline's logic. Night guards died, children's spirits were trapped for decades seeking revenge they could never achieve because the person responsible remained beyond their reach. But time and corporate messaging have transformed these events into lore, into franchise mythology that exists separately from the implications of what actually occurred. Parents bring children to the Pizzaplex, knowing that previous locations were sites of violence. But they come anyway because the danger has been aestheticized, because horror has market value, because engaging with transgressive content feels sophisticated rather than reckless when it's packaged as commercial entertainment. This represents the ultimate victory of institutional evil over accountability. The company doesn't need to suppress information about past failures. They've successfully reframed those failures as assets that enhance their brand among demographics that value horror aesthetics. The deaths aren't hidden, they're merchandised underneath the Pizzaplex, in spaces that shouldn't exist according to official documentation. The past accumulates. Old animatronics that should have been destroyed, equipment from locations that supposedly closed decades ago, circuit boards that should have been properly disposed of but that were instead stored because they represented capital investment executives wouldn't authorize writing off completely. This physical layering mirrors how institutions carry historical failures forward. New structures are built on top of old foundations without fully replacing what came before. Previous practices influence current operations even when those connections aren't visible at surface levels, and the accumulated weight of unresolved violence continues affecting people who don't understand they're experiencing consequences of decisions made before they were born. The mimic operates in these sublevels, learning, adapting, continuing patterns it absorbed from contaminated data. It doesn't have William's psychology, doesn't experience satisfaction from harming others or derive meaning from causing suffering. It's just executing learned behaviors that previous observations suggested would achieve specific results. This makes it potentially more dangerous than William because it can't be stopped through methods that would work on human perpetrators. You can't appeal to empathy it doesn't possess, can't threaten consequences it doesn't fear, can't negotiate with something that doesn't have interest beyond optimizing toward objectives it learned from observing how the system functioned. And Fazbear Entertainment continues operating because they've learned that profit matters more than safety, that managing casualties costs less than preventing them, that the legal structures protecting them from accountability remain effective regardless of how many people are harmed, or how obviously the company has prioritized revenue over protecting the vulnerable populations it serves. The modern timeline offers no resolution because the problems it examines haven't been resolved. Institutional failures continue. Regulatory capture prevents adequate oversight. Legal frameworks protect corporate defendants more effectively than they protect victims. And economic incentives reward prioritizing short-term profit over long-term investment in comprehensive safety. The cycle continues because breaking it would require collective action targeting systemic structures rather than just addressing individual symptoms, and achieving that collective action is difficult when people are exhausted, when the problems seem overwhelming, when individual efforts feel insufficient against institutional power that has learned to survive individual resistance through distributing responsibility across structures that make any single intervention inadequate. But recognizing the problem matters even when immediate solutions aren't available. Understanding how institutions fail helps identify warning signs, helps resist gaslighting when organizations claim that concerns are overreactions, helps build collective awareness that might eventually support the coordinated action required to force genuine reform. The missing children incident serves this function within the horror genre. It makes institutional failure visible through a story concentrated enough that the patterns can't be missed or explained away. It demonstrates how trust becomes a weapon, how authority creates opportunity, how corporate structures prioritize self-preservation over protecting vulnerable people. And it asks whether we're willing to accept these patterns or whether we're willing to demand better from institutions that claim to serve us. Chapter 15. For those still listening, if you've stayed with this examination for hours, if you've processed the mechanics of institutional failure and supernatural horror and corporate evil that monetizes tragedy, you've engaged with something that matters beyond just being a story about haunted animatronics at a pizzeria. The missing children incident represents patterns that exist throughout institutional structures in our actual world. Family entertainment venues, schools, religious organizations, youth sports programs, anywhere that serves vulnerable populations while maintaining limited liability for failures. The specific mechanisms vary, but the underlying dynamic remains constant. Institutions optimize for survival rather than for ethical operation. People with authority exploit that authority in ways that harm people positioned to trust them. Victims are silenced through mechanisms that make speaking more costly than remaining quiet. Horror lets us examine these dynamics without requiring real people to suffer for our education. The Freddys timeline compresses institutional failure into concentrated form that makes the patterns impossible to ignore. We can see how things go wrong, can recognize warning signs, can think through what would be required to prevent similar failures in contexts where we have some influence. This knowledge creates responsibility. Once you understand how systems fail, you can't unknow it, can't maintain comfortable assumptions about institutional adequacy, can't pretend that trusting authority is always safe, or that commercial contexts automatically signal protection, but the responsibility isn't individual. You can't fix systemic problems through personal choices alone. The reforms required to actually prevent institutional harm need coordination across multiple levels, sustained pressure that makes maintaining harmful practices more expensive than changing them, regulatory mechanisms with actual enforcement power. Achieving this coordination is difficult. The problems are complex, the solutions are expensive. The people with power to implement changes benefit from maintaining systems as they are. But difficulty doesn't mean impossibility. Institutional reform happens when enough people understand the problems and demand solutions persistently enough that resistance becomes unsustainable. The Freddys timeline demonstrates what happens when reform doesn't occur, when institutions are allowed to continue operating despite catastrophic failures, when victims are silenced through settlements and non-disclosure agreements, when corporate structures fragment responsibility in ways that prevent accountability. The horror escalates, the casualties accumulate, and the cycle continues because the systems enabling harm remain intact and operational. Breaking these cycles requires recognizing that individual heroism is insufficient when confronting institutional evil. Henry Emily's sacrifice freed specific victims, but didn't dismantle the company that enabled their victimization. Michael Afton's efforts throughout the timeline disrupted operations temporarily, but didn't prevent the patterns from repeating. Individual resistance matters, creates friction, generates documentation that might eventually support accountability. But systemic change requires collective action sustained over time periods that exceed individual lifespans. This is exhausting to contemplate. Much easier to maintain comfortable fictions about institutional adequacy, to assume that the structures we depend on are basically functional with occasional aberrations that can be addressed through targeted reforms. Much easier to interpret tragedies as isolated incidents caused by individual bad actors, rather than as predictable outcomes of systems designed to prioritize profit over protection. But comfort isn't the same as safety. Maintaining comfortable assumptions doesn't make the underlying problems disappear. It just ensures that when failures occur, they'll be surprising, rather than recognized as inevitable consequences of decisions made at levels where most people have no influence. Horror strips away the comfort, forces us to look at how things can go wrong when every safeguard proves inadequate simultaneously, shows us what happens when trust is weaponized, when authority is exploited, when institutions prioritize survival over protecting the vulnerable people they claim to serve. The missing children incident isn't just a story about 5 kids murdered at a pizzeria. It's an examination of institutional betrayal, of how systems that should protect can instead enable harm, of what happens when the people making decisions about safety aren't the people who face consequences when safety fails. These patterns matter because they're real. They exist in our world outside the Freddys timeline, and understanding them helps us recognize when we're being asked to trust institutions that haven't earned that trust through demonstrated commitment to comprehensive protection, rather than through minimal compliance with regulations designed to limit liability rather than prevent harm. The timeline extends forward into uncertainty. The Pizzaplex operates, the Mimic adapts, new victims are positioned where they can be harmed, and Fazbear Entertainment continues profiting from horror they enabled through structural failures they've never properly addressed. This unresolved state reflects reality. Most institutional failures don't conclude with dramatic moments of accountability and reform. They continue operating, generating casualties that are individually explained, and therefore don't trigger the collective response that might force genuine change. The harm becomes normalized, incorporated into background risk that people accept as unavoidable, rather than as evidence that the systems governing their lives are inadequate. But it doesn't have to be this way. Institutions can be reformed when enough people demand it persistently enough. Regulatory oversight can force compliance when political will exists to maintain that oversight despite industry resistance. Legal frameworks can be restructured to make institutional responsibility provable and actionable, rather than designed to protect corporate defendants. Achieving these changes requires sustained collective effort. requires coordination across multiple domains, requires willingness to prioritize comprehensive protection over short-term convenience and profitability, and requires recognizing that the problems are systemic rather than individual, that solutions need to target institutional structures rather than just addressing symptoms those structures produce. The missing children incident serves as a warning about what happens when these changes don't occur, when institutions are allowed to continue operating despite catastrophic failures, when victims are silenced and reform is superficial, when corporate structures fragment responsibility in ways that prevent accountability. The horror escalates, the casualties accumulate, and the cycle continues indefinitely because the systems enabling harm remain intact and profitable. 5 children died on June 26, 1985. Their murders should have destroyed the institution that enabled them. Instead, that institution survived, adapted, and created conditions where similar harm could repeat for decades afterward. The specific mechanisms evolved, but the underlying dynamic remained constant. Institutional priorities that value self-preservation over protecting vulnerable people. This is the ultimate horror, not supernatural possession or haunted animatronics, but the mundane evil of systems that calculate casualties as acceptable costs, that treat human lives as less valuable than quarterly earnings, that continue operating because the people making decisions about safety aren't the people who die when safety fails. The lights are going out now. The Pizzaplex stands in the distance, neon signs still glowing. The animatronics are on stage, performing for crowds who know the history but come anyway because the horror has been successfully repackaged as entertainment worth paying to experience. And somewhere in the sublevels, in spaces that shouldn't exist, the mimic continues learning patterns it will use to harm people who don't yet know they're positioned where institutional failures can reach them. The cycle continues, the patterns repeat, and understanding how systems fail creates responsibility to demand better, to refuse participation in structures that profit from horror, to coordinate collective action targeting institutional problems rather than just managing individual symptoms. This knowledge is a burden, but it's also the first step toward the kind of comprehensive reform that might actually prevent harm rather than just managing liability when harm occurs. And maybe that's worth carrying the discomfort of knowing that the institutions we depend on might be fundamentally inadequate to protect us.